College football nerds here talking Georgia and Cincinnati, a super interesting game in this bowl season. We're going to get into some numbers, get nerdy with y'all. Josh, my co-host, and I always do that. Probably got some fresh faces here, especially Cincinnati fans. Want to remind y'all, as usual, as we do with everybody, a couple of things. One, if you like and subscribe, it helps us out a ton. If you share us on your platform, if it's a message board, a Facebook, Twitter, if you can share this video, it helps us out even more. And finally, and maybe most important, give us your score prediction in the comments, you knuckleheads. That way we can get down in there and mix it up with you, and we will. Y'all know we will. Georgia fans can attest to that. Okay, Josh, this game is interesting because it is that sort of litmus test. And there's a lot of people that say Cincinnati should be in the playoffs. We need to give a G5 team a chance. We don't necessarily disagree with that. We have some maybe qualms with that in some instances, even with an undefeated G5. We might touch on that later. But in the past, one of the things we've heard, sometimes I think it has merit, sometimes it doesn't, is the Power 5 team that played the G5 team and lost was not motivated. Maybe not even Power 5 G5. We heard this with Georgia, Texas a few years ago in the Sugar Bowl. This year, I think it's a little different because Georgia knew early on, probably after the Florida loss, that they weren't playing for the national championship. They weren't going to the playoffs. So it's not like a last-second loss pulled those hopes out from under them, and now they got to go play a bowl game they don't want to play in. It's a lot different this year. Georgia, I think, is going to be motivated for this game. And you and I were talking before we hit record, and you've got some thoughts on that as well. Obviously, Cincinnati is motivated to show everybody they belonged in the playoffs, though I will argue that you should have been motivated to stomp Tulsa by more than 3 points to show everybody in the playoffs. But this is an opportunity. I want you to maybe illuminate us a little bit, kind of walk us through the motivation factor here and the potential for either one of these teams to possibly expose the other, maybe not as a fraud, but shock them by being better than they expected.
Both these teams go into this game with a lot to prove. In Georgia's case, it's a 2-loss team with 2 bad losses. But those losses dated back, to beginning of November, which seems like, okay, November, that's late, but that was actually almost 2 months ago. And I think Georgia's losses, in their mind, aren't reflective of who they are. They played better after the Florida game. They won both their last 2 games by significant margins. They played much better offensively through the stretch, especially after Florida. And I feel like they've turned a corner and they want to show it, particularly in the passing game. Obviously, Cincinnati ended the year with a couple close wins that I think is what kept them out of the top 6. Now, Cincinnati fans may take that a lot of different ways. I think if Cincinnati goes out and stomps Tulsa, we'd be having a very different conversation because I think you would have been somewhere probably in the top 6 if you win that game like 50-10. The problem was Tulsa was a minimally ranked team. Tulsa had already lost to Oklahoma State, for example, 16-7. You needed to show that you were better than an Oklahoma State, which no one would argue Oklahoma State was or should be in the playoffs. And the failure to do so means Cincinnati needs to make a statement now. But while I believe that emotion's important, and I think emotion can be an overriding factor in games, some teams come out flat, some teams come out hot, I think more often than not, I tend to find that it's about matchups and is about circumstance. A lot of times motivation or lack thereof is used as an excuse for teams. It happens in the SEC level or the P5 level where one team has a, quote, inexplicable loss, and it's usually because they're facing somebody that plays really good defense in an area that exposes them, or their offenses, especially these modern super high-power passing offenses, have down games. And it's not so much lack of motivation, you just didn't play well. But I think a lot of times it's really just matchups. There are the potential for both these teams to sort of shock the other in terms of matchups. The first thing that's the obvious one is Georgia comes from the SEC. And we'll get into a model later that we run that's sort of a baseline model. And our model is based off looking at how you did against your opponents and how they did against everyone else. Normally, we have some out-of-conference touch points, and that sort of serves to give, somewhat of a boost to a conference that's outplaying another, where, your stats in a season against one conference are not quite the same as stats in a different one. This year, there's no such touch point. And it's possible that going into this game, we have a really bad estimation of where the conferences lie. I say last year we did, and the culprit there was actually the Big 12. We flagged in Twitter, the Big 12 had only played a couple teams with a winning record out of conference. They lost both those games, and there was this potential for them to get exposed, and they ended up being horrible in bowl season. That could happen again to an extent that we don't even know, and no one, including Vegas, knows it. But the other side here is I think Georgia could be a little shocked by what Cincinnati represents defensively. The last 3 games for Georgia are the JT Daniels show. And we've taken some heat talking about him a little bit on Twitter. I will say that's mainly me, not Daniel. I'll own up on being the culprit here. But my point has not been that JT Daniels is bad. Now, in the offseason, I had a lot of skepticism of him. But my point has been JT Daniels isn't really proven. And that's because of who they played after the Florida game. Now, you can look at the point total, 31 points, 45, 49. They've got 9 passing touchdowns in 3 games. But who did they play? South Carolina and Missouri are 108th and 109th in FEI defense this year. Those are objectively terrible defenses. And those numbers are as bad as they are because they were probably worse than that to end the year. Mississippi State was a really weird situation because they had less than 50 players when they played Georgia. The majority of their back 7 was missing in the Georgia game, and what had generally been a pretty good defense was in fact a shell of itself when they played Georgia. And I'll note, weirdly, that was probably the best game that Georgia's had. That's not to say that Daniels is a bad quarterback, but it does mean he's a little bit unproven. Cincinnati is 5th in FEI, and I don't care if you're SEC and AAC, 108th and 109th and 5th are pretty darn different. And Georgia going into this game is going to face by far the best defense that JT Daniels has had to throw against. And I think as much as Georgia fans are probably thinking that they may shock Cincinnati with your overall talent and athleticism, and I'll point out, there's 8 missing starters for Georgia. This is not the Georgia team that started the Alabama game. Get that out of the way. You just have to know it and accept it. But this is still, the top to bottom was the most talented roster in college football going into the year. In terms of recruiting rankings, the most talented roster. Everybody on this field for them is elite. Even with all that said, they're still going against an elite defense. And I think there is the potential for those guys to be a little bit shocked or taken aback because a lot of things that have worked for Georgia probably are not going to work for Cincinnati just because they not only play sound defense, but they play sound physical defense and can disrupt what you want to do offensively. So I think this game really on both sides has the potential for somebody to walk out of this game being a little shell-shocked.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is, look, Cincinnati has played a G5 schedule, and it's not their fault. It's COVID year. We don't have the G5, P5 games that we normally have. We don't have interconnecting data points. Georgia's down a lot of players, especially on the defensive side. That scares me a little bit if I'm a Georgia fan. But I also think offensive line, still excellent. Running backs, still excellent, assuming everybody's healthy. I think there's an opportunity there for Georgia in the run game to really, as you said, shock Cincinnati. And then defensively, Cincinnati has had games where they haven't put on an offensive show against G5 defenses that are worse than who Georgia is going to field, even with all of these starters out. And Vegas sees that. Vegas sees it as a 6-point game. I think that's the spread, a 6-point favorite, even with 8 starters out for Georgia or eight players out for Georgia. That's significant in terms of the overall. Should Cincinnati be in the playoffs? That's significant in terms of how Vegas sees, because people can say that we're homers, we're SEC homers, we're keeping it 4 homers, but Vegas doesn't care about any of that crap. They care about getting it right. And I know everybody says, well, they want money on both sides equally, and that's all they care about. But if they came out and said Cincinnati was going to win by 50, obviously they're not going to get money on both sides. It has to be a reasonable line to get money on both sides. So one counter I will have to the JT Daniels thing, and you didn't necessarily say this wasn't the case, it's fair to point out that he's played trash defenses. It's also fair to point out that Georgia was struggling at quarterback against a Kentucky defense that Alabama put up 63 on. It's fair to point out that JT Daniels is making throws, especially in the red zone where the field is shrinking and it's hard to make these throws. He's making throws that we didn't see all year long from Stetson Bennett and Mathis for Georgia. So there's some opportunity there. I think you're right. The big thing here is there's opportunity on both sides to prove who they are as a team, and it's the best team to go against to do that. So we talked about what Vegas said. Why don't we talk about what the numbers say? Get us into the computer model, and we'll kind of pivot off of that.
I already introduced the model at a high level. It's purely relational. It's based only on this year. It doesn't take into account things like opt-outs or recruiting rankings. And it's designed to give us a baseline. It's a neutral starting point that we don't tweak. And it tells you, based off how you played, if this season, if you both give your B-plus game, this is how it's going to look like. Huge caveat. Our model does not know how to separate the AAC and the SEC because they never played each other. So it is essentially assuming that Georgia and Cincinnati played in equal conferences. It assumes the AAC and the SEC are relatively equal. With that backdrop, this game is actually a pretty even match in our model. And one of the things it does is it talks about opponent averages. So if your opponent averages 5 yards a carry, you allow 4, you allow 80% of their averages. Georgia is an excellent run defense, 56% of their averages. They are not a great passing defense, allowing 93%. Georgia, the past few years, has generally been in the 70s in that regard. Now, it's always a lot easier to stop the run than the pass. We see the run get in the 50s all the time with elite defenses. The pass defense never gets below 65, 70%. Passing games travel. That's why passing games end up being the things that win playoff games. And it's why that wins in the NFL. Cincinnati, 76, 74% is just an elite defense all around. A lot more complete than Georgia, who's a more run-focused team. The interesting thing is how that applies to the matchups in this game. Cincinnati is a run-first team, 5.6 yards per carry to 8.3 yards per attempt. Georgia's numbers are a little skewed. Our model is not based off recency for various reasons. One is it tends to be more fool's gold than anything. But it does make it a little inaccurate when you have something like a change at quarterback. I think Georgia's numbers are a little better than what's represented here. But Georgia's a 4.8 yard per carry, 7.8 yard per attempt team. And that, as far as our model, comes out to about 4.6 yards per play for Georgia, about 5.2 for Cincinnati. Neither team is expected to run for 4 yards per carry. The difference in the two teams is that Georgia is expected to be something like 5.8 yards per attempt and 7.7 yards per attempt for Cincinnati. And that gives Cincinnati a 28-27 lead. Now, again, we often look at this model and we sort of say, I'm not sure I want to agree with it. We said that in the SEC championship game, and that model was 48-43, which was pretty darn accurate for Alabama. So I always have a lot of caution when I say this doesn't make sense, because usually when I think it doesn't make sense, is exactly when it's picking up on something that people don't see at the eye test. But in this case, I do think it's really interesting because these conferences don't have anything in alignment. And the thing that I want you to take away from the model more than anything is if you look at Georgia's average performance in the season, not their JT Daniels performance, not their Bennett performance, the average across the entire season, Georgia's performance relative to the SEC is about the same as Cincinnati's performance relative to the AAC. And Cincinnati is expected to outproduce Georgia to a certain extent, but what the model is really flagging is that Cincinnati struggled to score when they weren't putting up a ton offensively. And given how much more effective Georgia is defensively than most of the teams on Cincinnati's schedule, it expects this game to look a lot more like the Army, South Florida, or Tulsa games for Cincinnati. And Georgia is expected to be able to put up 26 to 28 points because they're more pro-style, old-style offense, and those tend to score 25 on about anybody. And that's why you get to this 28-27 range, and that's before you take into account any sort of differences in conference quality.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, that this model is assuming both of these teams played the same level of competition because, again, we don't have interconnecting data points. They played the same level of competition, and they've come out with about the same outcome, and people are going to say, well, there's 2 blowout losses for Georgia. those blowout losses were performances relative to those teams who were blowing people out. And especially in the Alabama game, Georgia at full health really gave them a run for their money for 2.5 quarters. The point here is, and I think this is why it's fair for us to say Cincinnati is a good team and not necessarily a playoff team. And Cincinnati fans might get mad at that, but one of the things that we do on this channel is we give a candid, honest view of how we feel about things, and it's not always something that wins us favor with fans. We actually don't do great with Georgia fans because we picked Florida to win the SEC championship. They're actually their division this year, and
I might have picked Georgia to be a 3-loss team
Yeah.
when I found out the quarterback situation, which I will say doesn't seem so crazy now. But
right. So we don't chase numbers, we don't chase fans, and it's to our detriment because sometimes we're overly candid. But look, the 3-point win over UCF, the 3-point win over Tulsa. Had you performed that poorly on a day where you were playing in Alabama or Florida or even a good, not great Power 5 team, it would have been a loss. And for us, if we're evaluating you as a good team, as a good, great, whatever team that's going to play in a nice bowl, we're not nearly as harsh. But if we're evaluating you as a playoff team, and this is why we didn't have A&M in the playoffs, because 17-12 over Vanderbilt, struggled with LSU, these types of games are warts. If we're evaluating you for the playoffs, we're going to view a 3-point win over Tulsa. When you're trying to show the world that you're a playoff team, we're going to view that as we would a loss to an Alabama or anybody else. You just happen to be playing Tulsa instead of Alabama, so you got to win instead of a loss. And maybe that's not fair, but I think it's served us well in terms of predicting outcomes, not necessarily serving us well in terms of gaining a lot of fan following. Okay, Josh, I want to give my prediction in this game. I think Cincinnati is a very good team. I think they're a borderline great team, not an elite team. I think one of the things that's going to hurt Cincinnati in this game is having not faced a lot of top-level competition throughout the year. In a normal year, they would have a couple of Power 5 games like they did. Even the Ohio State game last year, that helped them as a team, I think, to have that competition Georgia has. I hate that Georgia has the opt-outs. I still think Georgia, as you said, has a higher average level of talent. They're well-coached. They've had time to prepare for this game, and they're not going to, in my mind, they're not going to be able to use the excuse if they lose this game that they weren't prepared. But I think Georgia's a better team. Give me 31-24 Georgia, with the understanding that I think this is a better Georgia team now than the one that faced Florida. And that if this score pans out, a 1-score win for Georgia, I had to do that quick 7-point math in my head, and it took me a minute. I will still, at the end of this season, say that Cincinnati is a top 10 team, had an excellent year, and is an excellent team. But I think Georgia's a little bit better.
I'm going to say 27-21 Georgia, which actually means Cincinnati covers. To me, the edge in this game really comes down to the run, which is something we didn't spend a ton of time focusing on. Cincinnati's offense has been predicated on its ability to run the ball and how much teams have had to devote resources to stopping that. Late in the year, Cincinnati's passing offense took off. We were very critical of Cincinnati because the passing game wasn't very good early. I think the trick is, that Houston-East Carolina game, Cincinnati has put up 9 yards a carry. And in the UCF and Tulsa game, those teams dedicated a lot more resources to the run, and it was at their detriment in terms of the pass. And people have not been able to balance the two. I think Georgia can actually stop the run straight up. And I'm going to be interested to see how Cincinnati does throwing against that. But without Stokes at this point, and given their situation, I do think they'll put up points. But I also think Georgia is going to be very frustrated in this game. I think Georgia's passing game, which has been very vertical, but it's been sort of predicated on taking shots against single coverage, usually against backup corners. I think they're going to find the sledding a lot harder here. And without the ability to hit those shots, I think there could be a lot of difficulty in moving the ball with consistency. So, with that in mind, I really think it is Georgia's offensive line and run game, which has really, as much as people talk about Daniels and his performance, the main thing Daniels has done is it's allowed the run game to open up, and they've been a 7.5 yard per carry team the past few weeks. I think that's where Georgia is able to edge out Cincinnati. I don't think I will be surprised if this is a game that gets 150-10, and I think that might be telling for one team or another if that happens. I think the reality is this is going to be a game where everybody's a little surprised at how hard both teams have to work to score. And I give Georgia a little bit of an edge here, but I do think it's very much an open question who would win this game. But I do think Vegas has it right that it's odds on it's about a score to Georgia's favor, but nothing surprises me.
All right, y'all. That's it for Georgia and Cincinnati. Let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be. We'll mix it up with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week.